First of all, thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me. I have already learned a lot, and I find it it's a fascinating project. It's really the absolute top of the research in this area that we have in Europe, and the amount of work and the way it has been presented today and kind of allowed me to learn a lot. And I think the topics chosen for today are also extremely relevant in today's policy discussions that we have in Brussels here. So I look forward to a very fascinating debate. The question that I would like to somewhat focus on is essentially what we have heard today means for setting the 2040 targets in Brussels. We, as you know, the European Commission last year, based on the Scientific Advisory Board, came up with a proposal for not yet a proposal, but kind of a communication that suggests that a 90% decarbonization target by 2040 would be the right thing to do. In previous projects, work that has been done by colleagues here also suggested that this is a sensible target, but now the communication from the Commission is not moving forward as fast as expected. So the communication was always, or the proposal was already expected. It is partly held back by the presidential elections in Poland, that because Poland currently has the presidency in the European Council and does not really want to have a discussion on on very ambitious climate policies ahead of these elections. But it's also held back by a very much shifting global context in which we are active. And then, I mean, I was quite fascinated to see what Robert presented in terms of efficient pathways, and the question to which degree is 90% still the right number for 2040. And maybe my first question to you would be to kind of highlight 2 or 3 considerations on your end that we should take into account when setting those 2040 targets. So before kind of diving down into what the result is, maybe what should we keep in mind when thinking about setting the right 2040 targets, reflecting a bit on your work. And maybe Johannes, I can put you on the spot, because I found the work on distributional effects relatively fascinating. We've looked into that in the past, and I think you provided a lot to the literature to substantiate some of the claims that have been already there, but you really made sure that this is robust scientific results.
Yeah, I think very, very good question. Even though on the efficiency or let's say of the 90-degree target, Robert would be the right person to answer. Yeah, I think there are many points to consider. Certainly the political feasibility point is important. So that's what we looked a bit into, or like the social feasibility, right? We saw a lot of backlash. We see opinions turning sometimes in some survey work that we did also, that there's a backlash towards these too ambitious targets. So, and this 90% target is very challenging. We saw even very costly and maybe not, let's say, optimal in some models, because it's just very fast, and well, Robert can comment on that. So I think this political or social aspect is very, very important. From what we saw is it can be substantial, so there can be substantial cost, right? I mean, we looked at some cost metrics, have not yet done that ultimately, but there might be significant short-term losses, right? We had some other works also relating it to the Ukrainian energy prices, and it will be more than what has happened. And we saw what caused that. So I think it's very important to be very careful in not being overly ambitious, even though it might be equity related.
Maybe I can push you a bit on the distributional effects. I mean, you mentioned on the one hand that in global fairness terms, 90% might be essentially middle of the road of what our ambition level should be, but you also mentioned the possibility of having international transfers to some degree to accommodate that. Would you have a view on?
Yeah, I mean the transfers is, I think, a bit separate discussion, right? We see it. I mean, it's not really much related. So the EU discussion is to my understanding at least. So maybe it would be good to connect the two more, even though they seem the one is more at the UNFCCC level, the other more at the EU internal. It might be good to connect it a bit more. Mark has maybe also an opinion on that. I think also the credibility of the policy is something that is important. Maybe we did a survey, for instance, on the 50 Fit for 55 target, asking people, and basically people believe that the reduction will only be around 42% by 2030. So there's a kind of, and this credibility gap could increase even if we be focusing on 90%, which is a very stringent number, and we saw models might even find it hard. So I think that's another aspect, but it's different. But yeah, from the equity perspective, maybe Mark, I mean, I don't know from your findings, what do you think comes out?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So it's a related but separate discussion, namely what, as a global community, do you want to achieve? So the European Commission wants to have a target for the EU, of course, but at the same time, we have the global context of wanting to achieve the 1.5 degree. And reasoning from that, yeah, I guess 90% is a bit middle of the road when it comes to comparing the three perspectives of equality, responsibility, and capability. But the one where you weigh historical emissions, which is the responsibility one, pushes, and that is also what the ASAP-CC pointed to, pushes to over 100% that the European Union should do. So I guess it's a related question of what do we want to achieve as a global community. If that is still the 1.5 degree, then apart from setting a domestic target for 2040, thoughts should be spent into thinking about paying for mitigation elsewhere when considering this distributional question. Otherwise, the 1.5 degree or these global targets that are, it is again a separate question, but a related question, are becoming unfeasible.
I mean, the reason why I'm pushing is that in the past weeks, I think in Brussels, the discussion has opened up. I mean, after also the COP in Baku, that somewhat operationalized Article 6 as a tool for trading international mitigation outcomes. There seems now a feeling that having a climate target domestically that it's potentially slightly below 90%, and having on top of that the opportunity to kind of buy additional shares of mitigation from outside the EU seems to become kind of a real discussion, which we haven't had in Brussels for a very long time. So that's why I'm trying to see a bit on what the merits of that approach are and not are. And maybe Robert, you can say a word on kind of if we still have 1.5 degrees in mind, and I know that your results were mainly for the European Union, but if we still have 1.5 degree in mind, is it physically necessary that Europe goes to 90% by 2040, and is it the efficient approach, or would then be a kind of a sort of mixed approach also be able to achieve that target if that can be actively deployed?
Yes, very good question. If you're asking for physically necessary, then I can clearly say no. Physically necessary is bringing global emissions down. That is theoretically possible in many countries. Now the question is, where is it more efficient and where is it politically feasible, institutionally feasible? And there clearly the EU is in a much better position to do more than most other countries. I mean, if you look at the last months, clearly the US has taken a large step down. So other countries need to step up to still make 1.5 or bringing us back to 1.5. I mean, we're anyway in an overshoot trajectory, but to keep this overshoot limited, to limit the additional damages that can happen from staying at higher degrees for a longer time. Now, what is cost efficient? That is something where actually your differences between models become much larger. Like, I mean, I've shown, as you said before, quite narrow results for the EU. If you look at how this is distributed across other world regions, the ranges become much larger because the uncertainty is so much larger, and what is possible in mitigation in China, in India, in Africa, in Latin America. So there is definitely possibilities to do emission reductions other places. I think what is really important is that the EU has to be very clear that it does not go below a certain limit in internal reductions. And I think if these techno-economic analysis, they show very clear pointer at I would say here 85%. And it needs to be clear that if we open this possibility of having emission reductions in other countries to achieve the headline target of 90%, then there need to be double and triple safeguards that we don't open this to do internally only 80 or 75%, because that is clearly sub-ambitious, and there becomes very unlikely that other countries can pick up enough to make this possible.
No, that's absolutely clear, and I think that is the huge risk involved in this debate, that it is, I mean, opening Pandora's box on many fronts, and including on the domestic EU political front, that kind of the whole system gets washed away, and on the international scene as well. Johannes, are there any kind of suggestions for targets inside the EU and differentiation potentially of targets inside the EU that you would be able to draw from your results? Because when we discuss a 2040 target, we will also have a discussion on whether we go for a full ETS1, ETS2, ETS everything, or whether we still go for an effort sharing to some degree. Have you looked into that, or some views based on your research?
You mean between member states?
Between member states, yeah, in terms of targets.
Maybe I would point again to Mark. I don't know if that was part in that burden sharing works between countries. Me, not personally, but yeah, it's of course an important question.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we also on the tool online, you can navigate to different member states, and there you see quite big differences when it comes to ability to pay for mitigation between, say, how baseline emissions go into the future. So how much effort is even demanded from countries, and also in terms of historical responsibility. So yeah, that's a discussion to have. Indeed, these effort sharing results differ quite significantly among countries.
If I may follow up with one point, I think what is important to keep in mind that different countries have different abilities to pay, and clearly there will be different mitigation levels achieved. But overall, if we're in such a world where we internally reach 90 or 85%, we only have a very limited emission base left. And a lot of that will actually be in aviation and maritime, which you cannot push around countries. And for the rest, it's, yes, you can have an internal trading, but the total amount that is of emission that remains to be traded is very limited. So it still means every member state has to be really far in their internal mitigation pathway. So no country can possibly be at less than, I don't know, maybe minus 75%, because there's simply not enough to go around for the whole country, for the whole continent.
Maybe to follow up on that, so I fully agree, and also take into account that differences across the world are much larger than differences within Europe, right? So that appeals to what member states should do within Europe, to take into account that abilities to pay of, say, a lot of countries in the global south are significantly lower than abilities to pay within Europe.
Yesterday I had some discussion with some Central East Europeans on ETS2, and I mean, their argument was, we are buying all your second-hand cars and we are running them until they are 30 years. And therefore, for us, it will be much, so the sequencing will be much more difficult for 2040 than for you that buy the new electric vehicles.
Very interesting or very important point to see how is the stock and how is the appliances are handed down. And I agree that that is a brutally important part for 2030. And that's also why we see 2030 targets varying so much between countries. But by 2040, we have a fully developed appliance system where all newly sold cars will have been electric for 5 years. It means you have a very large second-hand market for electric cars. And at that moment, like the total ownership cost of an electric car is lower than for a internal combustion engine car. So by 2040, you will actually see benefits for these poorer member states to also bring large shares of their vehicle fleet into electric on a second-hand base, so to say. Still challenging, and there needs to be funds from the central ETS pot, so to say, but still the transformation has to happen there. Otherwise, it will be impossible for the whole EU to reach their target.
I would like to open now to the audience, both online and here in the room. So I would try to keep the discussion a bit centered around achieving 2040 targets if possible, but if you have other clarifying questions, please go ahead. So please kindly introduce yourself so that we...
Yes, hi, I'm Victor Acremont. I'm a sociologist from Sorbonne University. You touched, so I had a question for Robert. You touched a little bit on the fact that solar and wind had deployment rates that seemed feasible compared to what happened in the last years. What about CCS and hydrogen?
Well, very good question, because for CCS and hydrogen, we have very limited historical deployment rates that are beyond subsidized or large prototype plans. We know there was a huge wave of CCS and hydrogen projects in the 2010s, where there was a certain hype and then a break of that wave. But we see a lot of new projects being developed over the last 5 years. Whether they're feasible or not is impossible to tell a priori. We know, like we colleagues in our institute compared the growth rates required for hydrogen and CCS to other technologies that we've observed over the last 30 years. And for hydrogen and for CCS, the ranges that we showed here seem to be very ambitious, but still feasible if the incentives are right. So they're not completely taken out of the blue and show rates beyond what we've seen in PV in the past, but it's clearly very ambitious and need strong drivers.
I would have another question, maybe to you, or maybe to all of you, on economic geography of decarbonization. Now, if we go for very strong decarbonization targets, it means a lot of renewables, as you Robert has shown, and we have very different kind of resource endowment in terms of wind and solar. And we also have then the potential to have very different consumption patterns, and transporting clean energy is, in our understanding, much more expensive than it is of transporting oil and coal was. So is there in the modeling assumed a re-optimization of where industry is happening, or where then, I don't know, sustainable aviation fuels are going to be produced, and how much of that can potentially also counteract some of the distributional effects, or even increase those distributional effects that you have shown? So is at this level of pressure that we put to the system, does that become a real concern, or are we? It's just an afterthought that will happen at the margins, but it's not a big issue?
I think it's actually a quite important issue. And the simple answer to the calculations on the global fairness is that that is not taken into account. It's actually those calculations are purely from first principles. Say we have a carbon budget, so how much can we still emit? What can every country still do? And the exact details of how do you account for emissions? That is only a step 2, trying to fill in those targets. So, and that touches upon, I think, an important problem also when thinking about, or at least an important thought when thinking about international emissions trade. Also, how do you account exactly for emissions. Indeed, also when it comes to consumption, when it comes to additionality of mitigation, these type of questions have to be resolved well if you go in that direction. But maybe the others can fill in more on this.
I mean, maybe on the location question, which of course some models capture. I mean, there's a couple of issues. Of course, we see, I think now all the models capture, for instance, grid investments. We see, of course, there's a large need for grid investments to deal with the different locations, storage, etc., capacity. Between countries also, I mean, electricity trade is also, there are certain limits, of course. So I think typically there is not a large relocation within the EU between countries. It might be in some models differently, but I think in terms of installation, at least where we did look at member state results, we see a large, the results are not the same, of course, because supply and availability is different. We see, let's say, more wind, of course, in let's say more northern countries. Different switches, for instance, for Poland, Norway. I remember we see quite some different patterns. But roughly speaking, I mean, it's across the countries and basically everywhere they switch to renewables of different types, maybe. But big relocation, I think, I think it's not what we find so far, but the impacts are, there are some differences, of course, especially also in losses. Like, for instance, I remember Poland, Czech Republic, also Norway, we see some big, let's say, more dramatic impacts on some industries, especially of fossil fuel.
But do you get different sort of energy prices or electricity prices in different countries as a result of different resource endowment that then feeds back into where new investments in electrified industry happen?
I don't know, maybe
from what we observe in the scenarios we did here, there are temporary differences between the different member states. And that is mainly if you look at which countries still have a substantial coal base in their power sector, with ETS prices picking up over the next 5 years, they will be hardest hit by that. So you see these effects becoming more stronger and then reducing after 2030 as all countries go to very low carbon power sectors. What we didn't do in ECMF, but in a German project actually with a large consortium, was look into industry competitiveness within Germany, EU, and other world regions. And there we do see keeping all of the industries in their exact current state, that will be likely very costly in a world going to climate neutrality. We do see, however, that it doesn't mean all industries have to relocate, but that you can actually take sweet spot in the middle where you have some semi-finished products, where you have direct reduced iron that is produced in regions, Northern Africa, Australia, and so on, where it's really, you expect huge, abundant renewables resources and very cheap energy. And that is then imported, keeping most of the value add still within the EU. So there is some change that is going to happen and that needs to be managed, but seem to be possible ways where Europe doesn't deindustrialize completely, but finds a relevant intermediate position, so to say.
Good. So, I think it's a very important question, and I think it will also feed back then in the inequality discussions that we are having, because my feeling is that this is the second round of the political opposition that we are going to see in terms of relocation of energy-intensive industries. I mean, we are having this debate right now in Brussels quite substantially. I would like to close the panel here.